First of all, I was taught with great humility. And with the gravity and responsibility of big jobs like that in the West Wing, you have to have humility. And I feel that many people slinked away in shame, were fired, couldn't cut it, could not keep pace with the volume and velocity and ferocity of our work. And I always just tried to keep my moorings, to understand, who I am. God made me. He has a plan for me. And I also tell young people all the time now, Doug, that whatever God has created, no man or woman can cancel. Don't forget that.
We are delighted to be joined by a woman who not only had an inside seat at the White House, she also had an extraordinary amount of influence on President Trump. As a veteran of politics and how to navigate Washington, she was also very influential when it came to Trump's pro-life stance, his engagement with pro-life community, including showing up at their annual pro-life march, but also when it came to choosing candidates for the Supreme Court. So lots to cover. She may know about whether Mr. Trump is going to run again. We could spend several minutes more going through her long record, but better to jump right in with our guest, Kellyanne Conway, and her new book, Here's the Deal. Kellyanne, thanks so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me, Doug. It's a pleasure.
I forgot to mention that one of your accolades, your resume achievements, you were the Blueberry Pageant Princess circa 1984 in Hamilton, New Jersey, so awarded. And this is really pretty incredible because you packed 39 crates and 9 pints, that's 477 individual pints of blueberries in only 35 minutes. Wow, that beats counselor to the president.
You know what? It sure does. And I can tell you that blueberry farm taught me an awful lot about a great work ethic and being responsible, accountable to the rest of your team, and just focusing and getting the job done. Unfortunately, Doug, the job of the blueberry packer has since been outsourced to machines. Not exactly China, but outsourced to machines. But it was a great way of growing up, the wonderful farmland of South Jersey, the part that gives the state of New Jersey the nickname the Garden State. Thank you for mentioning
That's that. Right. And I didn't mention that in light because it really is, I often find, a case that early childhood oftentimes plays such a key role in what people do as adults and what they achieve as adults. And to that point, you talk a lot in the book about your family and the lack of men in your household. I'll quote from your book. The only male in our family was Pudgy, the dog, and he, very tellingly, stayed outside. The inside dog, Beauty, was a girl. My father left us when I was 3 with no child support and no alimony. He left for the other woman and the other child. The men in our family didn't just have side pieces. They didn't just have comares, as we say in Italian. They had side families. Fascinating story. But at the same time, you're surrounded by love in your household.
Absolutely. It was a very unconventional household, very circuitous route all the way from my house to the White House. But Doug, I also think in many ways it's a common American story. You see many children, particularly from Generation X, my generation, who at some point before the age of 16 were in a single family household. They come from, quote, broken homes. But I never noticed because I was just surrounded by love and support. My mom, her mom, and 2 of my mother's unmarried sisters raised me in that house. That Stone Rancher in Acco, New Jersey. I call them South Jersey's version of the Golden Girls, with the housecoats and the humor and the cheesecake vendors and everything. Mm-hmm. But, about my father, I also think this is a very common story I'd like to pass on to your viewers, and I write extensively in my new book, Here's the Deal. My father left when I was 3, and he went to have another family. I met him when I was 12, and we had a loving present relationship for 40 years until he passed away 2 years ago. I believe that the story of my father is one of second chances, and if I, as a Christian, am looking for mercy and redemption and forgiveness from others, I sure am going to grant it when I'm in a position to do so. Mm. And he was a wonderful pop-up to my children. And as I say, a fully loving and present relationship for many years. But look, that house in South Jersey, those women who raised me, I say our soundtrack was a swinging back door and screen door. And we had so many conversations around that wooden kitchen table. But the most important thing we had was each other. Family, faith, freedom. We owed it all to God. We were a very faithful household, very faithful people. My mother, I'm sure, struggled financially to put her daughter into Catholic school, into the local small Catholic school. She wanted me to have those values. She wanted me to feel protected and loved and nurtured. And I did. And the men in my life, my cousins, my uncles, extended family, priests in our lives, they were very influential to me as well. And I'm very grateful to them for filling in the blank. I'm a huge believer of a 2-parent household, but I'm also a product of of an all Italian Catholic women household. These 4 adult women raising me. And I think it's very important that kids today, especially with screen time and school time and so many distractions and mental health concerns, I think as long as these kids know that they're loved and they're cared for and that somebody is looking them in the eye. My conversations were eyeball to eyeball, and we were responsible, accountable. We had chores. But we gave it all up to God. I'm sure there are kids today who would rather do something other than go to their place of worship on the weekend. It's really important that we have a connection to things bigger than ourselves.
You know, you talked about how you could very easily have become a man-hater, but you didn't. You had forgiveness for your father. And I suspect that that carries over to many other men in your world, including the former president of the United States. And to the point of being surrounded by, all these Italians in your house and the talkative nature, you have that anecdote about bringing a college friend home to your house. And at the end of her visit, she said, "Why is everybody always yelling at each other?" And I understand this dynamic because I'm married to an Italian, but that's not yelling, it's just talking in Italian. But that brings me to Donald Trump, your boss. I was not the White House correspondent at Fox News, but I filled in there a lot, and I saw you in action a lot. And I heard the stories of chaos at the White House. I wonder if your childhood upbringing in that chaotic household, a loving chaotic household, enabled you to be a better counselor to the president.
Well, it certainly enabled me, but maybe not with the word chaos. Because unfortunately, I see chaos and crisis everywhere we look now with this White House, at the gas pump, in the grocery store, in the supply chain, disruptions at the southern border, at the border of, well, no longer the border of Ukraine and Russia now that Putin's invaded. I think there's crisis and chaos everywhere we look. But I think in the Trump White House, the reason I was a good senior counselor to President Trump has a couple things. First of all, I was taught with great humility. And with the gravity and responsibility of big jobs like that in the West Wing, you have to have humility. And I feel that many people slinked away in shame, were fired, couldn't cut it, could not keep pace with the volume and velocity and ferocity of our work. And I always just tried to keep my moorings, to understand, who I am. God made me. He has a plan for me. And I also tell young people all the time now, Doug, that whatever God has created, no man or woman can cancel. Don't forget that. But I think in the White House, what really helped me is I grew up feeling like an outsider. I grew up feeling like I wasn't, quote, normal, or I didn't have the conventional upbringing or household. And Donald Trump got elected in large part because he was the political outsider. He was the wish fulfillment of what voters had told a pollster like me for decades. I want someone who has a ton of experience, who's never held office before. Well, who's that going to be? Who's, political. So I always felt a little bit different. And then I was really shunned and sidelined and ridiculed and denigrated by not the old boys network, but the new boys network, the male dominated Republican consultancy for years. They never freely gave me a seat at the table, even if I had earned it. And so I felt that Donald Trump saw something different and he wanted something different, and he is different. So all of that operated to my benefit as well. Plus, I loved my job. There's great value in public service. I tell people, particularly younger people asking my advice about their careers and their academic pursuits, I tell them, look, if you can fit in public service or nonprofit work into some point in your career, do it, because the work itself is the reward.
On the subject of being an outsider, while you were in college, you spent a year studying abroad in London, and you met Frank Luntz, the noted pollster there. From that experience, you got to work for Frank. You started your own polling firm, and you worked outside of Washington in many respects. You had clients who were outside the Washington world. And I wonder, on the subject of being an outsider, if that was just really invaluable because you learned to listen to real Americans.
Oh, yes, Doug, the gift of my professional life before I got to the White House certainly was spending decades listening to Americans, not talking to them or for them or at them, listening to them. And that's what great pollsters and great parents do. You listen carefully. And I have learned to appreciate and absorb and really assimilate into the decision making the essential wisdom of people. They've thought through these very complicated, tough policy issues. And frankly, many of them would be much better representatives than the representatives are of them, because they literally can't afford to make bad mistakes or exercise poor judgment. It will be very costly, literally costly to them and their families. And rather than, look at them as Hillary does, as deplorable and irredeemable, I really learned to look at them as knowledgeable and earnest and forthright. And I think more people should be listening to more Americans. Everybody chooses what media they listen to or watch now or read because it tends to undergird their own points of view. And I also, speaking as a faithful person, when you travel around the country, when they say, how's it playing in Peoria? I'm getting on the plane to go figure it out.
Mm-hmm.
When you travel around the country, you quickly realize what an amazing country filled with beautiful people this is, but how different we all are. We are the same in so many ways, but we choose how we spend our time. Do we spend part of our weekend at a professional sporting event or at a child's sporting event? Do we spend our weekend at a place of worship? Do we? So you tend to see how people spend their time, their money, what their frustrations are, but also what their aspirations are, which is it
And
comes
you
from a very different place.
right, and you paid special attention to listening to the women of America, and you actually cite instances where many professional pollsters, oftentimes men, would disdain them or reject their observations. You paid very close attention to what women had to say.
I did, and I tell of these focus groups with these male consultants in the back viewing room, and I went to sort of debrief with them. They were working for the Cuccinelli campaign in Virginia in 2013 for governor, and they had already left. I said, where are they? I couldn't even believe they had left. I mean, maybe they're out taking a smoke break or tucking in the 3 kids that their wives were raising at home for them night after night, but they couldn't have left. And, it's fascinating. His pollsters had predicted he would lose by about 10 points. Ken Cuccinelli against Terry McAuliffe. Does this sound familiar?
Mm-hmm.
In 2013. And instead he lost by less than 3 points. And I honestly feel like if they had the same respect for the female voters that maybe I was developing, they could have won.
Mm-hmm.
But look, I believe that the thing about women is I feel that we're often told, oh, women only care about abortion. Why are you communicating to us from the waist down? When from the waist up is where my brain, my eyes, my ears, and my heart are. My goodness. And we see over time that many women have become increasingly pro-life as the Democratic Party has started to migrate into the extremes. Partial birth abortion, sex selection abortion long past the point at which nonpartisan doctors and scientists say a fetus feels pain.
Yeah.
They've read the headlines of the 22 and 23-week-old baby being born unexpectedly, early, and surviving and thriving and having a full, productive, wonderful life. They know how difficult it is for some women in their peer group, their circle of life, to become pregnant and to deliver that baby. So there's a new appreciation for life. In many ways, the fetus beat us. And for the Democratic Party, honestly, to be stuck in 1973 to be so vociferously hanging on to Roe versus Wade and pretending that we don't know more now, even if you don't care about the issue one way or the other, even if religion or morality has not gripped you one way or the other, the science and the medicine steps in the breach and makes many people, including if not especially Doug, think twice about it.
I want to ask you more about your influence on the President of the United States when it comes to abortion in just a moment. But you talked about Ken Cuccinelli's campaign in Virginia for governor, which he lost narrowly, and the political consultants who directed that campaign, the same consultants who directed the campaign of Bob Dole, who lost, John McCain, who lost, Mitt Romney, who lost, Jeb Bush, who lost. Let me quote. Of the Romney presidential campaign, you reserve stinging criticism. Quote, for all their strategic brilliance, Stuart Stevens and his firm managed to bill more than $8 million to the campaign. I've heard of success fees, but in the Republican consultancy, to the losers also go the spoils. A collection of non-Wizard of Ozes were behind the screen. Comment.
Fact check, true. And then, of course, they went on to have the Lincoln Project, which would not have existed without Kellyanne Conway's husband as part of it, not existed to that extent. So basically, they enriched themselves again, this time working against not only the Republican presidential nominee, but the Republican president. And of course, they were secreting, hiding, covering for somebody who was promising sexual favors to people for jobs and whatnot. Of course, the Democratic apparatus said that they really had nothing to do with nothing major to do with Biden's win. So I call this staph infection. I think the Republican consultancy for years was a walking RICO violation. And it's not a gender thing, except they made it that way. I'm not saying, oh, they're male dominated because I don't like men. I'm saying they're male dominated because they kept losing. They kept failing upwards. And what happens in the Republican consultancy, unlike the Democratic consultancy, is that they were allowing the Republican presidential nomination process to take on the form of a consolation prize, nominating the person who had lost to the person who won. Mitt Romney, perfect example. And then they were a consolation prize or a coronation. Who's next in line? Who's the next king we can crown? And of course, they never saw Donald Trump coming. They never saw Donald Trump's voters. They never understood. They still don't understand the Trump voters. You know why? Because we never deeply examine that which we deeply disdain. And they, kind of like Hillary Clinton, disdain the 74 million Trump voters, where they would say, look, I don't like Donald Trump. I didn't like his tweets, or I don't care for this, that, and the other. But let me try to figure out what's motivating the record number of American men and women who turned out for a sitting president, 74 million.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a complete lack of curiosity about them and a ton of disdain. So I think donors should take all this into account. I've had a great professional life. I'm 1-for-1 presidentially. I've made a very, very good coin as a Republican pollster and consultant over the years. I gave up millions of dollars to stay out of the White House, to go into the White House and be a public servant. So I'm perfectly comfortable with all of that. And that gives me a lot of credibility to say to the donors and the activists, the grassroots supporters sending their $10 here, their $40 there, be careful, because you're sending it to consultants who don't know you, who don't like you, who don't appreciate you, and frankly, who are against many of the issues, the positions that you hold dear, and against perhaps President Trump or against other up and coming elected officials who you may support. Be careful who you're supporting.